Hello everyone and welcome to the final video of my full set review of Hour of Devastation. I've covered all the other cards in the set, all the single colored cards in the set. Today we're covering the remainder of the cards and we'll finally have looked at all 199 cards in the set. Today we're looking at multicolored cards, artifacts, and lands. Before I jump into the review, here's a quick reminder on how I grade these cards. Remember, if you've already seen me talk about how I grade these cards, you can click on a timestamp in the description below or in a comment below if someone else beat me to it. And this will allow you to just skip ahead to where the first card is. Just like with Amonkhet, I'm using letter grades to help me to explain how good I think these cards will be in the new format, and I will provide a letter grade for every card after discussing each of them. These grades are an easy way of summing up what I have to say about the card, and have to do with how highly I can see myself taking them. To help convey what each of these grades mean, I'm going to provide examples of cards from Amonkhet that I think deserve each of these letter grades. Let's start with A. Cards that are in A are bombs, an incredibly efficient removal, and are the kind of cards that you want to be first picking, or are so powerful that they pull you into their color. There are not a ton of A's in any format, and I'm pretty stingy with them. There are the best cards in the set, and the vast majority of them are mythic or rare, though occasionally uncommons make it into the A range. Some examples of A's from Amonkhet are cards like Angel of Sanctions and Glorybringer. These two cards are insane, and so powerful that they can win games on their own, both providing large flying bodies and the ability to remove other creatures, making them very powerful. Next, let's look at B's. These cards are obviously not quite as good as A's, but are still very good and are, in cases where there isn't a huge A-level bomb in the pack, still cards I'm happy to take with a first pick or an early pick. These are very good removal spells and very efficient creatures with powerful abilities. They aren't quite as game or draft warping as A's are, but seeing them past pick 4 or 5 is a pretty good signal that a color is open and for you to jump into it. Most B's are of uncommon rarity or higher, though occasionally commons can make it into the B range as well. Some examples of B's from Amonkhet are Oncrop Crasher and Angler Drake. These cards are very powerful and can help shift the game in your favor and are good at any stage of the game, but they aren't cards that completely warp a game when they are played, like, let's say, Angel of Sanctions or Glorybringer. Still, both of these cards are cards I'm happy to first pick and ecstatic to get any later than that. Next, we have C's. This is what the vast majority of cards in a set are, and they appear at every rarity with regularity. Solid and playable cards that you neither feel good or bad about having in your deck is sort of the definition of a C. These are decent creatures like 2-mana 2/2s with some small upside and solid removal. Some examples of C's from Amonkhet are cards like Colossopede, just a 5-mana 5/5, sure, it's fine, and Cursed Minotaur, a 3-mana 3/2 with Menace. These are both cards that you feel fine about having in your deck, but you don't exactly feel excited about. From there, we move to D's. These are cards that are playable, but just barely, and are cards that you generally aren't happy to have in your deck. They usually only end up there when something went wrong in your draft, like being unsure about what colors you should be in so you don't end up with enough playables, and thus you're forced into playing cards of this level. There were actually a lot of D's in Amonkhet because cycling made what would otherwise be F's into D's. Some examples of D's are Violent Impact and Watchers of the Dead. Neither of them really does enough to be card you're excited about having in your deck. Watchers of the Dead is a 2-mana 2/2 with no real upside, and Violent Impact is a bad artifact removal spell that happens to have cycling. You'll play them when you have to, but you don't really want to. Finally, we have F's. These are cards that I think you should never ever put into your deck and are terrible. Just like there aren't many A's in this set, there usually aren't many F's, but they are always around. Weirdly, there are actually a decent number of rares and mythics in this category, since they often like printing unique and strange effects on cards of that rarity. Some examples of S from Amonkhet are Glorious End, just is a terrible card. Any card that says you lose the game on it is probably not something you want to play. You had to end up in a very narrow situation for it to actually work. You had to cast it on your opponent's turn and be able to kill them on your next turn, otherwise you just lose. And Hazoret's Monument just basically does nothing. You don't really want to be playing the card. It doesn't have a big enough impact on the game. It's not worth the card in general. In addition to these more clear-cut grades, there are also two categories of cards that I will present more than one grade for. The first of these are Sideboard Cards. These are cards that generally you don't want to have in your main board. They're either a D or an F if they're in your main board, but they are better in certain matchups out of your sideboard. An example of this from Amonkhet is Stinging Shot. It is a D in your main board, since it will frequently never have a target and just get cycled, but out of your sideboard, it gets all the way into the B range because it is incredibly efficient removal for dealing with flyers. The other cards I will present two grades for are build-around cards. These are cards that are generally a D or an F in your average limited deck, but if you manage to get enough synergies, they become much better. An example of this from Amonkhet would be Nest of Scarabs, an unplayable card in basically any limited deck, but if you end up with 10 or more ways to make -1/-1 counters, it moves all the way into the C+ and B- range. This card being printed is actually pretty funny because of the timing. As those of you who follow me on Twitter know, I'm pretty into birdwatching, and I just got back from Israel. While I was there, I saw a lot of real-life Hoopoes, and I learned that the Hoopoe was the national bird of Israel just a few days before this card was spoiled. It's a pretty goofy bird, as this art and this picture both show you, and I have a soft spot in my heart for this card. Also, if anyone knows how I can get my hands on the original art for this thing, I'd be thrilled because Ryan Pancoast hasn't replied to any of my inquiries, sadly. Anyway, to get to the actual card, I love this card a lot, just based on what it represents. I'll try to be unbiased, though. A 2-mana 1/3 flyer is always solid and limited, and this one has a pretty sweet activated ability. Drawing a card and gaining 2 life for 5 mana isn't a bad deal. By adding life gain to card drawing, it tries to make sure you find time to cast a new card you just drew. That said, this card is very slow and all about grinding out wins, which you can do in this format, but things really have to come together in terms of lots of good removal and tempo plays and grinding out a win with mana to grind out a win with mana sinks like this one. So unfortunately for this little Hoopoe, he isn't going to quite make it into the B range, but it's still a fine card. I mean, a 2-mana 1/3 flying is perfectly reasonable. You'd play it in any blue-green deck, but don't go out of your way to get it. Sometimes there's going to be better cards in the pack for your blue-green deck, and to illustrate that, I'm giving it a C+. Next, we have Samut, the Tested, which is 2 colorless mana, 1 red and 1 green for a Planeswalker, Samut at Mythic. And it has 3 loyalty abilities. It comes into play with 4 loyalty. Its +1 ability says up to 1 target creature gains double strike until end of turn. Its -2 says Samut the Tested deals 2 damage divided as you choose among 1 or 2 target creatures and or players. And its -7 says search your library for up to 2 creature and or planeswalker cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. We have Nikobolas, who came out so cool, and then we have Samut. I prefer the creature version of Samut over the Planeswalker one by a lot. A 4-mana walker who forces you to be in 2 different colors to play, or better do something pretty sweet, right? Well, she doesn't. Not really. She has 4 loyalty, which is decent for 4 mana, but her +1 is more of a win more effect. Giving a guy double strike can mean that you can attack through boards you wouldn't have been able to, but the double strike isn't the kind of planeswalker ability that lasts until your next turn. It only lasts on your own turn, meaning that she can't really do anything to protect herself. If she gave double strike to a creature and that lasted until the end of your opponent's turn, it would sort of at least be a mediocre way to protect herself, but she can't even really do that. Her -2 is probably, her most reasonable ability, but still nothing incredible. It twin bolts for 4 mana, basically, is one way to look at it. But if she gets to twin bolt twice and you paid 4 for that, that doesn't feel too bad. That's fine. Her ultimate is quite good, but she's almost never going to get there, guys. She can't protect herself very well, and she doesn't kill big creatures. The only way she's going to win is if you already have a board presence. She's not the kind of planeswalker who will pull you back ahead in a game. Most planeswalkers are big bombs, but she's not. I'm only willing to give her a C. You'll play her if you're in the 2 colors. Don't get me wrong, and there will be games where she comes down and your opponent can't do anything to stop her, but they will be few and far between. She doesn't do much to pull you ahead in the game, as killing a 2 toughness creature or 2 X1s isn't really going to be game breaking. So yeah, she's just a solid C. Sorry, Samut, you should have stayed a creature. Next, we have the Scarab God, the next of these 3 gods that are in Nikobolas' various colors. This is 3 generic, 1 blue and 1 black for a legendary creature god at Mythic, a 5/5, and it says at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses X life and you scry X, where X is the number of zombies you control. And then it has an activated ability, 2 generic mana, 1 blue and 1 black, exile target creature card from a graveyard. Create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 4/4 black zombie, so basically eternalized. And it has the same clause all 3 of these gods have. When it dies, you get to return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. This one has a static ability that asks for a little bit more setup than the other 2 gods, though in blue-black it won't be that hard to get zombies between embalming and just having zombie creatures all over the place. But the activated ability here is nuts and will just allow you to run away with games as you start churning out 4/4 copies of creatures in graveyards every turn. It doesn't even have to be your own graveyard, it can be your opponent's graveyard. Doing that is probably going to just be better than playing cards in your hand, especially because then the god starts dealing more damage to your opponent with its upkeep ability. It's just churning out 4/4s for 4 mana every turn, and that's completely insane, especially if they're 4/4s that happen to have other text on them, which most likely they will. And again, it comes back to your hand even if it dies. Like all of these bug gods, this gets a straight up A for me. It's Gold, yes, but it is so good that you will first pick it and try to make it work. If it doesn't work out, you're going to feel sad about it too. But, you know, with all of these gold cards that I'm giving A's to, keep in mind that if it just doesn't work out, it's not going to work out. No matter if it's an A, you shouldn't really sacrifice your mana base to make the Scarab God fit into your deck. But it is an A. It's an incredibly powerful card, just like the other two gods are. And now we'll look at the final god, and that is the Scorpion God, who for 3 generic, a black, and a red, is a 6/5 legendary god at Mythic. And it says whenever a creature with a -1/-1 counter on it dies, draw a card. Then it has an activated ability, 1 generic, 1 black, and 1 red. Put a -1/-1 counter on another target creature. Also says that it goes back to your hand at the next instep after it goes to your graveyard. Again, 5 mana for a 6/5 is already something I'd be ready to sign up for, but this has way more text on it and makes it incredible. Alright, so let's go ahead and jump into our first gold card. First, we're going to jump into just the multicolored cards that aren't double-faced or any crazy thing like that. We're just going to talk about the gold cards, like Bloodwater Entity. So, Bloodwater Entity is an uncommon for 1 generic, 1 blue, and 1 red. And it's uncommon. It has flying, it has prowess, and it has when Bloodwater Entity enters a battlefield, you may put target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard on top of your library. This is the Signpost uncommon for blue-red, and this is a strong one. 3 mana for 2/2 flyer with prowess is already a really good rate, and adding the ability to put the best instant or sorcery cards in your graveyard on top of your library is pretty nice. Worth noting that not putting the instant or sorcery into your hand is kind of a big difference from putting it on top of your library, as putting it into your hand is actual card advantage, putting it on top of your library is only card selection, but it's still pretty good. If it put it in your hand, it would be insane, but this is still nice. Not quite as nice as putting it in your hand. Still, you want this card anytime you're playing blue-red, and because of that, I'm going to give it a B. This color pair is all about instants and sorceries, so, you know, getting back your red removal spell or your blue tempo bounce spell or whatever from your graveyard not only is going to be nice because you get to play one of your better instants and sorceries again, but also it's nice because you're going to trigger prowess on your next turn because the entity made sure that you're going to draw an instant or sorcery. Next, we go to the Locust God, which is 4 generic, 1 blue, and 1 red for a legendary creature god at Mythic. It's a 4/4, it has flying. It says whenever you draw a card, create a 1/1 blue and red insect creature token with flying and haste. Why not? Let's give it haste. Also has the activated ability 2 generic, 1 blue, and 1 red. Draw a card, then discard a card. And like all of these new gods in this set have, they all return to your hand at the beginning of your next instep if it goes to your graveyard. 6 mana for a 4/4 flyer is already kind of an okay deal. Not exactly what you want to be playing, but passable. This comes with the added incredible ability to crank out at least 1 flying creature token with haste every turn, and it comes with the built-in ability to loot, which can allow you to make even more tokens in the air while also helping your card selection. This is a true bomb. If it isn't dealt with, your opponent is going to be facing down a swarm in a hurry. Oh, and even if it gets dealt with, as I mentioned, it goes back to your hand. So the best they can do is slow you down, apart from exile effects. Those are around. This is a gold card, but it is one that is so powerful that you want to first pick it if you open it and try to play it in your deck one way or another, whether you're splashing or whether you end up in blue-red. Even if you can't use its activated ability, it is insane because of the massive number of tokens it's going to make you. This just gets a straight-up A. First pick it. It's gold, yes. Worth the risk because it's just that powerful. Next, we have Nikobolas, God Pharaoh, sort of the, I don't know, chase card of this set, symbolizing what this set is about. And Nikobolas is 4 generic mana, 1 blue, 1 black, and 1 red for a Planeswalker, Bolas. And he has 7 loyalty when he comes into play. Why not, right? Then he has 4 abilities, not just 3. Bolas doesn't do that. +2, target opponent exiles cards from the top of his or her library until he or she exiles a non-land card. Until end of turn, you may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Okay, it's a little random, and that's kind of annoying. But you're going to hit at least a spell of some kind every turn, and you're raising his loyalty to 9. His +1 says each opponent exiles 2 cards from his or her hand. All right, well, if your opponent's holding 2 cards when you play Bolas, this is probably the right choice, as it'll just get rid of their hand. And he also has a -4. He does 7 damage to target opponent or creature an opponent controls, all right? You can just kill your opponent with this sometimes. You're definitely going to be able to kill their creatures with it. And he also has an ultimate, of course, which is -12. Exile each non-land permanent your opponents control. So, he's incredibly powerful. All of these abilities are very good. All of them are things you're happy to do. Which one you choose to do depends on the board state, but I can tell you He can help you get back ahead if you're behind, either by giving you a free spell off the top of your opponent's library, killing your opponent's best creature. He can also help you solidify your win in the game. If your opponent is trying to claw back into the game, and then you get a free spell off at the top of their library, kill their best creature, exile the only cards in their hand, they're done. And so immediately when he comes into play, he's going to have one of 3 very impactful effects on the board. And then he also, of course, has an ultimate that just says, the game's over, you just lost everything you have in play, except your lands. And he comes with an insane amount of loyalty. He's not going to be easy to kill unless your board's completely empty or your opponent has an army of flyers. Even if he gets killed, though, I mean, you just paid 7 to do 7 to something, which isn't great, but it's pretty good. I mean, it's a lot of mana. The one downside to all of this awesomeness that is this Planeswalker is that he costs 7 mana. I guess this is 2 downsides. And he's 3 colors. So, and he's not green. Green is a color that, as we saw yesterday, can help you fix a fair amount. He's not green. So he can't really... Fixing with him is going to be difficult to do. So his only downside is that he's not easy to cast and he's not easy to actually build a mana base for. That said, with those caveats out of the way, he's an absolute A. I'll be first picking anytime I see him and doing everything I can to find a way to splash him, taking Evolving Wilds, taking, the deserts that help you fix, even if it's just filtering, because, if you want to cast Nikobolas, because he's probably just going to win you the game if he comes into play. Next, we have Obelisk Spider, which for 1 generic, 1 green, and 1 black is a 1/4 spider at uncommon with reach, as most spiders have. Also says whenever Obelisk Spider deals combat damage to a creature, put a -1/-1 counter on that creature. And also says whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This is the black-green Signpost uncommon in Hour of Devastation. It isn't nearly as good as its Amonkhet counterpart, Decimator Beetle, but it's fine. A 1/4 reach can disrupt the skies pretty well, it can block pretty well, especially when the creature happens to put -1/-1 counters on creatures that it damages. The problem is, this thing isn't a good attacker at all. Your opponent will just take it rather than deal with the -1/-1 counter shenanigans. It's almost always going to be best to leave this back. The fact that it drains your opponent for 1 life every single time you put a -1/-1 counter on a creature. Note, by the way, that it says 1 or more, so you don't get to drain them for every -1/-1 counter, just for every instance of placing them on something. So doing that is fine, but it isn't amazing. I'm not willing to give green-black Signpost uncommon more than a C, which is pretty low for a gold card that is supposed to push you into a color pair. I think there are a lot of other black-green cards that do stuff with -1/-1 counters I would take before this, and that's a real shame. But still, it's a decent card for that deck. It's just not... I think it's the worst of this cycle of Signpost uncommons in this set. Speaking of Signpost uncommons, next we have Resolute Survivors, which for 1 red and a white is a 3/3 human warrior at uncommon, and it says you may exert Resolute Survivors as it attacks, and it says whenever you exert a creature, Resolute Survivors deals 1 damage to each opponent and you gain 1 life. This is the red-white Signpost uncommon, and surprise, surprise, it is another strong exert card. In Exert Lord of sorts, it makes it so that any creature who exerts itself does 1 damage to your opponent and gains you 1 life. That adds even more aggression to a very aggressive color pair. It isn't hard to amass an exert-heavy board in this color pair either, so yeah, this is going to help those very fast decks win even faster. It gets a B- from me. It's not going to be worth first picking, because you have to end up in a red-white super aggressive deck to make it work, but once you're in that deck, it's going to be one of the best cards in your deck, and you'll take as many of them as the world is willing to give you. Next, we have River Hoopoe, which for 1 green and 1 blue is a 1/3 with flying at uncommon, a bird. And for 3 generic, green and a blue, it has an activated ability that says you gain 2 life and draw a card. Putting -1/-1 counters on things for 3 mana is already like an ability I would be in for on a 5 mana 6/5. That already would probably push it all the way to like a B+, but it also adds the ability of drawing you a card every time a creature with a -1/-1 counter on it dies, which is going to be a lot of the time. And again, it comes back to your hand even if they kill it, so all they can do is slow you down. Another straight up A. All 3 of these gods are sort of windmill slam first picks despite being gold, so keep that in mind. Even if you see them in your second pack and you're in one of the colors, taking them is probably worth the risk because you can try to splash it, and there's a chance you can. There's fixing in this format at artifact and land slots, so fixing that can fit into any deck. So all 3 of those gods are amazing. Next, we have Unraveling Mummy, which for 1 generic, 1 white, and 1 black is a 2/3 zombie, and it has 2 activated abilities. One of them is to pay 1 and a white. Target attacking zombie gains lifelink until end of turn, and the other one is 1 and a black. Target attacking zombie gains death touch until end of turn. This is the Signpost Uncommon for the black-white color pair, which is a zombie deck, and it's a pretty good one. It is worth noting that even on its own, it can give itself lifelink or death touch, and these are two pretty impactful keywords in Limited. Lifelink makes racing very difficult for your opponent, while making any of your creatures trade with any other creature with death touch is also good. That said, it only works on attacking creatures, and while zombies are aggressive usually, it would be nice if it worked on more than attacking creatures. Still, definitely a card you want if you're in black-white, and especially if you have a bunch of zombies. It will make combat a real nightmare for your opponent thanks to death touch. I'm going to give it a C+, since it will really only be at its best if you get a critical mass of zombies, like 10 or more. To be fair, there's zombies all over the place in this color pair, including cards with Embalm and Eternalize. Alright, so from here we're going to move into talking about other gold cards, sort of, but they're the Aftermath cards. Because of the unique nature of these cards, I will give 2 grades for them. One is based on if you were just playing the part of the card without Aftermath, and the other is based on if you're playing both halves of the card. In other words, that you're playing both colors that the card has. The first of these split cards we're looking at is Farm to Market. The farm half is the part you can cast from your hand. It's 2 generic and 1 white for an instant that says, destroy target attacking or blocking creature. The second half is the market half. That's the half with Aftermath. It costs 2 and a blue, and it says draw 2 cards and discard 2 cards. Just the farm half of this card is very good. It's a way better card than Impeccable Timing for only 1 more mana, and it's even better than Sandblast, one of the better commons in the set for the same cost. That's a good removal spell. If you're only playing white, I think the removal aspect of this card, as conditional as it is worth a B-, making this card worth first picking despite being 2 colors. Because if you're just playing the white half, you're still coming out pretty well with that first pick. If you're playing both colors, you get a little bit additional value out of the card. You get some nice graveyard value that you can cash in whenever you need to. It's unfortunate it's a sorcery, not an instant, but that's okay. The ideal thing to do with Market is use it in the late game to discard 2 lands, basically, and draw 2 cards if you have, 2 lands in your hand that you just want to get rid of anyway, or cards that have graveyard value, which blue-white has a lot of. It's sort of the home base for cards with Embalm and Eternalize and creature tokens and things like that. So that color pair works out really well for throwing things in your graveyard with value. You could also throw a card with Aftermath in if you wanted to. But the ideal thing is to draw 2 cards and discard 2 lands, which shouldn't be too hard to do. So a B- if you're just playing white. But if you're playing both, I think it pushes all the way into the B+ range because you have some late game graveyard value that can improve your card selection. Next, we have Consign to Oblivion, which for 1 generic and 1 blue, the Consign half is an instant. Both halves are uncommon, obviously. And it says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. The Oblivion half is 4 generic and 1 black. It has Aftermath, of course, and it says target opponent discards 2 cards. We've seen the Consign half of this card a lot. Disperse, for example, and it is always playable. Being able to bounce any non-land permanent instant speed is no joke. It makes combat tricks and auras look really bad, and it can provide some massive tempo swings. Being able to bounce any kind of non-land permanent is pretty nice. A card like this is a solid C or even C+ in most limited formats, and that's what the Consign half gets on its own. I like the Aftermath half of this card too, as it provides some nice late game value out of your graveyard. Mind Rotting isn't too bad of a place to spend your mana if you just have nothing else to do with it. These are sort of basically mana sinks once they go in your graveyard. Obviously you can also cast both halves together, albeit for a whopping 7 mana, and also get rid of the card you bounced to their hand. But the typical line will probably be to bounce something early and Mind Rot them late. If you're playing both of these colors, I do think this pushes all the way into the B- range. It's kind of worth thinking about first picking because if you're in both colors, it becomes a much higher quality card. But you're not guaranteed to be able to play the black half. But it has a pretty high floor because Consign is just a good card on its own. Next, we have Claim to Fame, which is 1 black mana for a sorcery on the part you can cast from your hand at uncommon. And it says return target creature card with converted mana cost 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. The Fame half has Aftermath, is also a sorcery, of course, and it says target creature gets +2/+0 and gains haste until end of turn. Returning a creature from your graveyard for only 1 mana sounds nice, but this is too narrow, only returning small creatures. Your deck really has to have a lot of 2s for this to be good, and it is a dead card in your hand until you build up your graveyard. The Fame half of this is okay. Obviously the ideal here is to pay the total 3 mana, get back a 2-drop creature while pumping it and giving it haste to either end the game or put a big dent in your opponent's life. but still, the fact that this only works well once your graveyard has the right kind of creatures in it makes the card too narrow and difficult to play. It's a straight up F if you can only play the claim half, and I guess I may even be being a little too generous here. I have it as a D if you can play both halves, but it may just be an F all the time. I can't really see a situation where it'll work out for me unless I have a deck with a ton of 2-drops in it. But even then, it's not going to be that great. Next, we have Struggle to Survive. The Struggle half is the part you can cast from your hand. It's 2 generic and 1 red for an instant at uncommon. And it says Struggle deals damage to target creature equal to the number of lands you control. The Survive half is 1 colorless and 1 generic, a sorcery with Aftermath. And it says each player shuffles his or her graveyard into his or her library. This is an interesting Aftermath card, mostly because the Struggle half is a premium level removal spell. If this card was just Struggle, it would be a B+ on its own. Removal that scales as the game goes on, and that is instant speed at only 3 mana is incredibly good. We had Stone Fury a few sets back in a much slower format, and it did the same thing but cost 2 more mana, and it was very good. Struggle is just a super good removal spell. Now, what does the second half of this card add to the mix? Almost nothing. It is nice to have the extra value in your graveyard in the late game. The main use for it would be making your opponent lose creatures in their yard with Eternalize or cards with Aftermath. Other than that, it isn't going to be doing much. As such, this card really doesn't get better if you're playing green, but it is already super good if you're playing red, and red decks want this card. You can just ignore the Survive half. You don't even have to play green. This is a B+, regardless of whether you're playing both colors. It's a first pickable card, one of the best uncommons in the set, and, you know, maybe you'll use the Survive half once in this entire format or something, but you'll be using Struggle all the time and be really happy about it. Next, we have Appeal to Authority. The Appeal half is 1 generic mana for a sorcery at uncommon that says, until end of turn, target creature gets trample and gets +X/+X, where X is the number of creatures you control. The Authority half is 1 white and 1 colorless for a sorcery with Aftermath, and it says tap up to 2 target creatures your opponents control. Creatures you control gain Vigilance until end of turn. Appeal on its own is a fine card. Worth noting that it isn't an instant, as such an effect often is, but 1 mana to give your creature at worst +1/+1 and trample for a turn isn't bad, and obviously it gets better and better the bigger your board is, and green-white decks are sort of going to be the best at making creature tokens in this format, at least the kind of creature tokens that help you go wide. If you can only cast Appeal, the card is like a D+. Maybe it makes it into the C range. It being sorcery speed and asking you to have a board makes it hard for me to say it's a lot better than that. However, once you add Authority into the mix, this card's grade really goes up. Authority taps down 2 creatures and gives your whole team Vigilance. And if you're green-white, Vigilance means even more because you probably have creatures with Exert. If you cast both halves together, you're doing a lot of work for 3 mana, and I think that's the optimal way to use this particular card with Aftermath, to just cast both together. If you think about it, if this was all 1 card, it would be a very good card, especially if it were monocolored, but being 2 colors makes it still pretty good if you can cast both, but not quite as good. I'm going to give this card a C+ for decks that can cast both halves. Making creatures unable to block by tapping them and making your creatures with Exert even better is hard to ignore. Next, we have Leave to Chance, which for 1 generic and 1 white mana is an instant, and it is at rare, and it says return any number of target permanents you own to your hand. The Chance half is a sorcery for 3 generic and a red with Aftermath, and it says discard any number of cards, then draw that many cards. This card's kind of bad. It seems like it has some potential for Constructed. It seems like returning all of your permanents to your hand and drawing a bunch of cards could be potentially broken in formats where you can generate a lot of mana and just like use all your mana to cast whatever it is that you're drawing off of Chance. But it doesn't seem very good in Limited. Leave isn't very good. You can use it to save a creature from removal or return a creature to your hand that has an annoying aura on it. But those situations aren't always going to be around when you have the card, and most of the time there will be no good reason to play Leave. Though again, having it in your sideboard when your opponent has a lot of aura-based removal, I'd probably bring it in. As just like a main board card, if you can only play the white half, it's probably like a D. It's not going to... You just have to wait for ideal situations. You can abuse into the battlefield triggers. There's going to be decks where it's playable, but they're going to be narrow situations if you can only cast the Leave half. The other half of the card... Chance does make this a little bit better. If you find yourself flooded out, or with creatures whose bodies are irrelevant on the board, returning 3 or 4 of them to your hand, discarding them, and drawing 4 cards is a good way of finding your way out of a flood. You can also return lands if you have too many lands. Still, I don't love the card, even if you can play both halves, and it only pushes it up to a D+ for me for now. This is a card that I want to play with because it's sort of a hard one to judge. It's sort of a weird card. but I don't imagine it getting much better than that. Next, we have Reason to Believe. Another one of these rare cards, split cards from this set. The Reason half is just 1 blue mana for a sorcery, and it says scry 3, and that's it. The Believe half is 4 generic and 1 green. It has Aftermath, and it says look at the top card of your library. You may put it onto the battlefield if it's a creature card. If you don't, put it into your hand. A card doing nothing but scry 3 is a unique effect that we haven't seen before, and frankly, I think 1 blue to do that is okay. People underestimate how strong scrying is, especially in grindy limited matches where it can allow you to draw much better than your opponent in the late game. If that's all this did, it wouldn't be that good. Scry 3 is probably like the value of like 3/4 of a card. You know, you'd probably rather just draw a card a lot of the time. But scry 3 is worth almost an entire card. But because it has Aftermath, and if you're playing green, it gives you some late game value. That said, if you're just able to cast the Reason half, it's probably a D+. But the Aftermath half makes things a little more interesting. At worst, it's going to draw you a card for 5 mana, and doing that out of your graveyard for, 5 mana in the late game with a mana sink isn't the worst, but it also can do some other things. If you reveal a creature, you get to put into play that creature, and if you're casting both halves of this together that is paying 6 mana, you're going to hit a creature because you're scrying 3, at least most likely, you're going to hit a creature. So in the late game, this sort of becomes more powerful when you can scry 3 and use Believe in the same turn. But you can also use a line of play where you use scry early to help you with your early land drops or whatever, and then in the late game you cast Believe just to draw a card. It's not amazing by any stretch, but it's a playable card if you're in blue-green, and I'm willing to give it a C. Next, we have Grind to Dust. It is 1 generic and 1 black for a sorcery at rare, and it says put a -1/-1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. The Aftermath half is Dust. It's a sorcery, and it says exile any number of target creatures that have -1/-1 counters on them. Just the grind half of this card is plenty good. It's a sorcery, speed, Splendid Agony for 1 less mana, and I think enough to push this card into the C+ range just if you can cast the grind half. The Dust half adds some more gravy, though, and actually it adds a lot of gravy, as if you can cast both halves at the same time, you end up killing at least 2 creatures with 1 card for a reasonable investment of 6 mana, and you exile them. So this means the annoying gods are even gone. You can, of course, cast the grind half much earlier, and then later use Dust, but the optimal way to use this card will be just to cast both halves at once. This thing is an absolute powerhouse if you're in both colors, as it provides a 2-for-1 that can even kill indestructible creatures or gods who refuse to stay in the graveyard. Oh, and if you have other ways of putting -1/-1 counters on your opponent's creatures, or they've been doing it on their own, you're just going to destroy your opponent. It says exile any number of target creatures that have -1/-1 counters on them. I'm willing to give this card an A- when you can cast both halves. It's going to be one of the best cards in your deck. It's going to be a great removal spell if you can cast both halves, and it has an incredibly high ceiling and a reasonable floor. So first picking this is an okay idea. It is like first picking a gold card. If you end up not being able to play Dust, it's not going to quite reach its potential. But if you can just play Grind in your deck, you don't feel too bad about that either. Next, we have Refuse to Cooperate, which for 3 generic and a red is a rare instant, and it says Refuse deals damage to target spell's controller equal to that spell's converted mana cost. It also has Cooperate, which for 2 generic and a blue is an instant. It's the Aftermath half, and it says copy target instant or sorcery spell. You may choose new targets for this copy. This is sort of a flip of what most of these cards are, in that the Aftermath half is definitely the more powerful half of these 2 cards. I don't like the Refuse half a whole lot. The first time I read it, I thought the Refuse could also hit creatures, but it can't, only players. And that kind of burn isn't very good and limited because you're not really developing your board, you're not hurting your opponent's board, you're just doing a little bit of damage. Building your own board would be a little better. Sure, you can occasionally do something hilarious like cast it on your opponent's Sandworm Convergence, but things really have to line up correctly for things to work out. However, once this is in your graveyard, you have Cooperate, which is very good. But I think Refuse, if you can only play the red half, is just a straight up F. The Cooperate half turns it into a fork, basically, and that's very powerful. It's an instant, remember that, so you can cast it from your graveyard at instant speed. Copying an opponent's removal spell or your own removal spell or another very powerful spell is really good, so you actually get a lot of the value here once this is in your graveyard. I think this is a straight F, as I said, if you aren't playing blue, and pushes into the C+ range if you're playing both colors. That's how strong a fork effect that doesn't cost you a full card is. You can sometimes just end a game in the late going with it too when you cast both halves together. If you Refuse and Cooperate in the same turn, doing something like 10 damage isn't impossible. So that's the last of the gold cards. Let's move on now to artifacts. Our first artifact is Abandoned Sarcophagus, which is 3 generic mana for an artifact, and it says, you may cast non-land cards with cycling from your graveyard. It also says if a card with cycling would be put into your graveyard from anywhere and it wasn't cycled, exile it instead. This is not my area of expertise, but this card seems pretty abusable and constructed to me. In Limited, I also think it's good, but obviously it's a build around. If you have less than 8 to 10 cards with cycling, it isn't worth playing. However, if you got there on cycling, this is pretty great. Decks with lots of cycling tend to cycle away cards early. This lets you get those cards back out of the graveyard in the late game, giving you some insane card advantage. If you're cycling any of these big hippos or beasts or whatever in the early game, and then casting them in the later game, that's amazing. I would feel pretty good after getting 2 or 3 cards of value out of the Sarcophagus, and anything after that, it starts to get ridiculous. But it's an F in your average Limited deck. But if you end up with a ton of cyclers, especially powerful ones, whether they're removal spells or creatures, it gets all the way up to the B- range, I think, because it just turns into an engine. Next is Crook of Condemnation. This is 2 generic mana for an uncommon artifact that has 2 activated abilities. One is to pay 1 generic and tap it to exile a card from a graveyard. The other is to pay 1 and exile the Crook, and you exile all cards from all graveyards. This card's a bad card in terms of being a main board card. Yes, there are lots of creatures with Embalm and Internalize, as well as cards with Aftermath, but not enough that you can feel good about main boarding this. It will be a blank against about half of your opponents, and not do enough to be worth a card against many of them. If your opponent is heavy on graveyard shenanigans, it does become a good sideboard card, so bring it in if your opponent's going nuts with Aftermath or Embalm or Eternalize. So it's like a C out of an F in your main board and a C out of your sideboard. Next, we have Dagger of the Worthy, which for 2 generic is an equipment. We only have 1 equipment in this set and 1 in Amonkhet. I think it's probably the block with the least equipment ever since equipment was originated back in Mirrodin block. Kind of sad because sometimes equipment's pretty nice. But anyway, it's an uncommon. It has equipped creature gets +2/+0 and has afflict 1. And it has equip for 2 mana. This is just overcosted for what it does. A total investment of 4 mana for +2/+0 and afflict 1 isn't going to be worth it. I would rather play Honed Khopesh, which gives you a much better output for the amount of mana it asks of you. This is just a straight F, and a good candidate for a card people will overrate. Equipment seems to perpetually be overrated, but I'm never going to play this card. Next is God Pharaoh's Gift, which for 7 generic mana is a rare artifact, and it says at the beginning of combat on your turn, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that card, except it's a 4/4 black zombie. Oh, and it gains haste until end of turn. So this eternalizes something every upkeep. Note it can only go after your own graveyard, unlike the Scarab God, who can go after anybody's graveyard. So we know what God Pharaoh's Gift does now. We saw it hinted at in Amonkhet, and it's a pretty strong card. Making 4/4 hasty copies of creatures in your graveyard every turn is an incredible engine, especially if you've been doing a good job of stocking your graveyard. This kind of late game value engine is the sort of thing that snowballs and ends games. That said, it asks a couple things of you. First, that you have 7 mana available, and make sure you can get to that stage of the game, and that you can provide a steady stream of creatures from your graveyard to get full value out of it. Only the grindiest of control decks will be able to take advantage of this card, and because of that, I don't think it's first pickable, as powerful as it can be. I'm going to give it a C. This is certainly a powerful card once in play, but making it so you can get it in play and get value out of it isn't something every limited deck will be capable of. Next, we have Graven Abomination, which for 3 generic mana is an artifact creature horror at common and a 3/1. And it says, whenever Graven Abomination attacks, exile target card from defending player's graveyard. This card's bad. I mean, it's like a candidate for worst card in the set. Like, it's not even worth sideboarding. It's bad. At least it's common, I guess. So, I mean, well, maybe not. At least you're going to get a lot of copies of this card because nobody's going to want it. 3 mana for 3/1 is a big fail on the vanilla test, so maybe it does something relevant, right? Nope. It exiles cards from your opponent's graveyard, and yeah, that can be good, but we've seen a lot of better ways to exile cards from your opponent's graveyard than playing this sort of horrendous body for the mana cost. It's not good. Don't play it. It's an F, and we'll move on from there. Next, we have Holoone, which for 5 generic mana is an artifact creature golem, one of my favorite creature types, so hey. And it's a rare. It also says Holoone costs 2 less to cast for each card you've cycled or discarded this turn, and it has cycling 2. A 5 mana 4/4 with cycling 2 is already an okay card. It would probably be like a C, C-. We saw that with Horror of the Broken Lands in Amonkhet, which is admittedly kind of probably better than this, despite being a common, because it also has a cycling payoff. And yes, this has a cycling payoff too, but it's not as good. Costing 2 less for each card you cycle is fine. Being able to cycle a card and then play a 3 mana 4/4 in the same turn is a pretty good turn. It isn't a bomb or anything, but casting this for 3 mana is something that will happen with regularity, and sometimes it'll even be better than that. It has a decently high floor, since a card who is sort of a meh creature who has cycling is something that makes the cut most of the time anyway. All in all, I'm going to give this a C+. Don't take it too highly, but it is certainly a solid playable that happens to be colorless, meaning it will basically always make your deck, so keep that in mind when you see it in a pack. Next we have Nanna Lift, which for 3 generic is an artifact. It's a reprint we've seen before. At common, you can tap it and add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. This is an okay source of fixing and ramp, but playing this on turn 3 over a creature who helps you fix or ramp is a little dangerous. Obviously, you're not always going to have a choice, and you have to have Nanna Lift if you're trying to play your Nikobolas or whatever. I would only play it, though, if I didn't get fixing from my lands or other cards I drafted, and I really needed to splash an off-color bomb, which means it's a D+. Like, if it's not the kind of fixing I would play all the time, it's just not worth more than a D+, I don't think. Next, we have Mirage Mirror, which for 3 generic mana is a rare artifact with an activated ability that says 2 generic mana. Mirage Mirror becomes a copy of target artifact, creature, enchantment, or land until end of turn. I like this card a lot. It seems like a lot of fun. Every turn for a relatively small investment, it can become a copy of the best artifact, creature, or enchantment on the table. This will make it difficult for your opponent to attack you profitably, as you can pull all kinds of shenanigans, allowing you to, at worst, trade with your opponent's best creature. Sometimes it will give you a second copy of your best creature too, which is obviously also very good. Still, the card is a little bit clunky, and it doesn't quite make it into the A- range, A range of bombs for me, but it is colorless and definitely a card that I would be happy to start a draft with, since I know I will be playing it no matter what. Overall, I give this card a B. Next, we have Sunset Pyramid, which is 2 generic mana for an artifact at uncommon. It's the only card in this set that deals with brick counters. In the end, the brick counter thing doesn't seem like it was a very well-developed mechanic to me personally. There just aren't enough cards that deal with it, and only one of them really ended up being playable and limited. Anyway, that's an aside. But Sunset Pyramid is 2 generic mana for an uncommon artifact, and it comes into play with those brick counters, and you pay 2 generic and tap it for an activated ability that removes a brick counter from it and draws you a card. So this sort of deconstructs itself instead of building itself up like the other brick counter cards, and you can pay 2 and scry 1 with it as well. I'm not ultra high on this card. Early on after it was spoiled, I know a lot of people were saying it would be great and limited, but I don't see it. Yes, it does give you card advantage with a single card, which is, I guess, what card advantage is. In the end, though, you invest 8 mana to draw 3 cards. That is a horrendous rate, and this format doesn't seem amenable to allowing you to sit back and do that most of the time. It is nice that even after it runs out of brick counters, it can scry for you, and scrying goes a long way towards winning a grindy game, but this will only be playable in a very narrow strip of decks. Control decks in the format will be fine with it, because they can make the game go long with powerful removal and good blockers, so the mana investment, while not ideal, becomes less of a problem, and you just end up with a ton of extra cards. But most decks in this format would rather play a 2-drop creature on turn 2 and not invest all this mana into an effect like this, so I'm only going to give it a C-. Next, we have Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs, which is 2 generic mana for an artifact creature wall. It's a 0/4 with Defender. You can tap it, and it says Wall of Forgotten Pharaohs deals 1 damage to target player. Activate this ability only if you control a desert, or there is a desert card in your graveyard. This is pretty much unplayable in a deck with 0 deserts, as a 2 mana 0/4 just isn't really going to be worth a card. However, once you get 3 or 5 deserts in your deck, you could do a lot worse than running this, especially if you were a control deck that wants early blockers anyway. This can give you a source of inevitability once you get a desert, while making it harder for your opponent to kill you thanks to being an okay blocker. Basically, an F with 0 deserts, and it moves into the solid C range with deserts. That's our last artifact, so now let's move on to lands. Our first land is Crypt of the Eternals, which is an uncommon land, and it says when Crypt of the Eternals enters the battlefield, you gain 1 life. You can tap it to add 1 colorless mana to your mana pool, and you can also filter with it, pay 1 and tap it to add 1 of the Bolas colors to your mana pool. Not quite a tri-land, which is what people thought it was when it was first spoiled. They thought it was a reprint of the tri-land that makes these colors, but it's not. It's not quite that good. But it does filter for those 3 colors, which is nice. Filtering isn't awesome. Basically, you're paying 2 mana for 1 mana. But if you really need fixing in one of these colors and you're playing one of the other ones, you could do worse. Still, this is like a D+. Filter lands are just slow, and I'm not that ultra interested in playing them most of the time. Next, we're going to look at all the cycling lands at once. They're basically all the same thing except a different color. They all come into play tapped. They're all deserts. They all add 1 colored mana to your mana pool, depending on which card in the cycle they are, and they all cycle for 1 generic and 1 color mana of the color that the land can produce. I like the cycle of lands a lot, and I'm glad they put them at common. Lands that cycle are already huge upgrades over your typical land because they provide you with flood insurance. If you draw them late and don't really want another land, you get to try again. In the early game, they're just lands. Yes, they come into play tapped, which is a bit of a downer, but the upside is greater than the downside here. What's more, as we've seen in other videos this week, lots of cards care about deserts being in play or in the graveyard, and that makes them all solid playables at sea. I'm happy to take them as early as, mid and then late pack for sure, and how much I want them goes up the more cards that care about deserts I have, and the more cards that care about cycling I have. However, even in the complete absence of deserts or cycling being relevant in my deck, these lands are going to be upgrades over your typical basic land. So Desert of the Fervent is better than a mountain 90% of the time. Okay, so picking these up late is great, no matter what you're going to end up doing. If you see these late, like 3rd or 4th last pick, they're better than they look because of the flood insurance they provide and the desert upside they provide as well. Next, we have Dunes of the Dead, which is another desert at uncommon. It only adds colorless mana to your mana pool, and it says, when Dunes of the Dead is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, create a 2/2 zombie creature token. A black one, actually. I left that part out. So there might be a few ways to sacrifice deserts in this format, but that still doesn't make playing this worth it. Only producing colorless mana is a big liability, and would only be worth it if this came with some real upside. And it doesn't. And even if you really need deserts, the rest of them in this set are better than this one. This is just an F. Don't play it. Next, we have Endless Sands, which is a desert, a land. At rare, it adds 1 generic mana to your mana pool, actually 1 colorless mana to your mana pool, and it has 2 activated abilities. The first is to pay 2 and tap it, exile target creature you control. The second is to pay 4, tap it, and sacrifice it. Return each creature card exiled with Endless Sands to the battlefield under its owner's control. Yet another desert, and while it is better than Desert of the Dead, it isn't very good. You can use Endless Sands to have your creature dodge an opponent's removal spell and then use the sands again to get that creature back. You can also stack a bunch of creatures under it, I guess, but there's no real reason to do that in Limited, unless you somehow have a battlefield filled with into the battlefield creatures and bringing them all back at once is this incredible thing. Generally, this is going to be a downgrade over a basic land in your deck, and the utility it brings isn't as good as many of the other deserts in this format. One thing that would have made this card interesting is if there were more effects that allowed you to steal your opponent's creatures till end of turn, because you can kill them, basically, by exiling them with it. So, generally, like I said, this is going to be a downgrade. There aren't really any ways to steal your opponent's creatures in this format. In red anyway, the kind that you just get a threaten effect is what I mean. You will run it though if you really need deserts, as it does provide at least a little bit of value by making it hard for your opponents to cast removal spells. So I'm going to give it a D. Next we have Hashep Oasis, which is a desert at uncommon, and it has 3 different lines of text. The first is that you can tap it to add colorless to your mana pool. The second is that you can tap it, pay 1 life, and add green to your mana pool. And the third is that you can pay 1, 2 green, tap it, and sacrifice a desert, including itself, but any other desert works too. And target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn. Activate this ability only anytime you could cast a sorcery. So this is part of a cycle too. We're not going to talk about them all clumped together because they all do different things. They're not the exact same as the other desert cycle, the common desert cycle that cycles. This is the uncommon desert cycle that all have activated abilities. They all add colorless to your mana pool, and they can all add colored mana to your mana pool for life. I'm always pretty into lands that add extra value, and this card is the first in a cycle of deserts, as I said, that produce colored mana and have activated abilities. What's nice about lands with activated abilities is because you don't have to add extra cards to your deck, but this card can operate as mana when it needs to, and as a spell-like effect when you need one. There is a cycle of these, again, in this set, and they like for you to control other deserts, though worth noting, they can sacrifice themselves. The Oasis has a pretty real effect. It's oftentimes giving a creature +3/+3 suddenly makes it so that you can swing through an otherwise stalled out board. The fact that it is a desert, and there seems to be several payoffs for deserts in this set, as we've seen this week, makes it even better. I'm going to give this a C+. Basically, it is a huge upgrade over putting a forest into your deck because of all the upside it provides, and thus, if you have one, you should always put it in your green deck. There's no reason not to play this. It's just better than your forest. This becomes even more true if you have desert payoffs. Still, while I think it is playable in every green deck, the upgrade it provides over your typical forest isn't exactly massive, enough to take it super early or anything. I don't hate the idea of picking this one up somewhere near the middle of a pack, though, and I think they are better than the cycling lands. Next, we have Hostile Desert, which is a rare desert. And it taps to add 1 colorless to your mana pool, and it has an activated ability where you can pay 2 and exile a land card from your graveyard, and Hostile Desert becomes a 3/4 elemental creature until end of turn, and it's still a land. I don't know why they filled the rare slot of deserts with all of these mediocre deserts, but they really did. None of them are very good, in Limited anyway. I could see this being good in like Modern, where you have fetch lands everywhere. Most of the time in Limited, this will just be a land that produces colorless mana and provides a little bit of desert upside. If you get some Evolving Wilds or cycle lands or Hash Up Oasis cards that are in that cycle, it gets to be a little better. It'll occasionally be a 3/4, and it's definitely true that opponents, especially if you're not playing online, will overlook this sometimes. They'll just sort of see a land and you can sort of get them with it because they attack with their 3/3, and you're like, exile my Evolving Wilds and block it, and they face palm, and it's awesome. But that's not going to happen that often. I would play this if I really had like a lot of reasons to play deserts, and I also had a lot of cards like Evolving Wild, Hash Up Oasis, and Cycling Lands, because it provides a little bit of upside, but that's basically the only time I would play it. That's a narrow set of circumstances, and because of that, I'm going to give it a D-. Next, we have If Near Deadlands, which is the black card in the Uncommon Desert cycle. It adds colorless to your mana pool. You can tap it and pay 1 life to add black to your mana pool, just like Hash Up Oasis, but for black. And then it has an activated ability, 2 generic and 2 black, to tap it, sacrifice a desert, put 2 -1/-1 counters on target creature and opponent controls. Activate this ability only time you could cast a sorcery. I was a big fan of Grasping Dunes and Amonkhet, and a big proponent of playing it in a lot of decks. And this is an upgrade over it in basically every way. Like the Oasis, it produces mana for you when you need it to, and in the late game it can be used to kill or weaken a creature. There are still -1/-1 counter synergies to be had in this format, and they happen to be in the black-green color pair the most, so it actually slides into that deck not only as a desert helper, a card that, you know, makes your cards that care about deserts better, but also as another source of -1/-1 counters. Picking it up mid-pack seems reasonable to me. I'm always happy to have a land that can be a removal spell in the later part of the game. That's a massive upgrade over just running a swamp, and this one is a C+. Next, we have Ipnu Rivulet, which is another, the blue uncommon desert in the desert cycle. It adds 1 colorless to your mana pool, or you can pay a life and add blue, and then it has an activated ability. For only 1 in a blue, it has the cheapest activated ability of any of them, but it also has the worst. Sacrifice a desert, target player puts the top 4 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. I like the first 2 of the lands in this cycle a lot, but I'm less interested in Ipnu Rivulet. Yes, if you have a lot of deserts, you can try to mill your opponent out, but that doesn't seem like the best way to try to win a game in this format, though it does seem fun. There just aren't enough great deserts around that you can do this enough for it to matter. You can also mill yourself and get cards with Embalm, Eternalize, or Aftermath into your graveyard, but again, that seems like sort of a waste of mana. It is still better than your run-of-the-mill island because it provides you with at least a little bit of upside, like if a game ends up going long and you're suddenly looking at your opponent's deck and it has 3 cards in it, hey look, you get to win the game. But it's not enough better that I would go out of my way to take it around mid-pack like I would most of the other cards in this cycle, even with other desert synergies around, and I'm going to give it a D. Next, we have Ramunap Ruins, which is a desert, an uncommon. It's the red card in the same cycle, which means it can add colorless mana. You can pay 1 life to add red mana, and then it has an activated ability. 2 generic and 2 red, and you sack a desert, like you do with all of them, and it deals 2 damage to each opponent. I think this is the second worst of this cycle of lands. The blue one is definitely worse, and this is definitely an upgrade over a mountain, but its effect isn't that great. Doing 2 to an opponent isn't normally going to be worth it, but it does provide a mana sink and maybe even a win condition if you manage to get like all 3 of your deserts in play. But what it does pales in comparison to, say, the white or the black or the green versions of this cycle, and I'm going to give this a C-. It's a good idea to pick them up if you see them around, you know, in the later part of a pack, because again, it's an upgrade over a mountain. It has desert synergy, but it's not quite as good as the other cards in the cycle. Although, well, it's better than one of them, but worse than the other 3. Next, we have Scavenger Grounds, which is another desert at rare that is pretty underwhelming. You can tap it to add colorless to your mana pool, and you can pay 2 and sacrifice any desert to exile all cards from all graveyards. Again, I don't know why these rare deserts are so lame. This is another one that only produces colorless mana, so it isn't ideal. And the effect it has, while sometimes relevant, isn't going to be a huge difference maker. I don't hate the idea of having this in my sideboard and bringing it in against an opponent with lots of graveyard action, because obviously it's pretty good against that. And if I really need deserts, I'm willing to play this one, unlike the ones that I've given Fs or like D minuses to. This one's just a solid D, and an okay sideboard card. Next, we have Shafet Dunes, which is uncommon. It's a desert. It's the white member of the uncommon desert cycle. Which means it adds colorless, or you can pay 1 life and it adds white, and then it has an activated ability. 2 colorless and 2 generic to sack a desert, and creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Activate this ability only anytime you can cast a sorcery. This might be the best card in the cycle, although I think the white, black, and green ones are all pretty close to one another. As the bonus it can provide is a very impactful one. Making all your creatures bigger is great if you can go wide, and it also doesn't hurt with creatures with Exert, who become even more of a problem. In the meantime, like the other cards on this list, it produces mana for you when you need it. If you're playing white, I think taking this around mid-pack is perfectly reasonable, and enter later than that, and I'd be thrilled to pick it up, which makes it a C+. Next, we have Survivors Encampment, which is a common desert. You can tap it to add generic mana, colorless mana, rather, to your mana pool, and you can also tap it and an untapped creature you control to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. If you really need fixing, you can do a lot worse than this. It is, of course, also a desert, which, if you haven't gathered yet, is an important subtype in this format. This is just a solid C. Any deck that wants deserts and or fixing will feel fine about playing it, and it's actually better than basically all of the rare deserts. I don't know, again, why they made the rare deserts so lame. But this is our last land and our 199th card we've looked at. We've looked at every single card in the format this week. I've given you my thoughts on all of them. But the limited review isn't quite over yet, though, as tomorrow I will put up the archetype guide in this format talking about what each color pair does. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button. If you disagree with any of my ratings, let me know in the comments below. Discussing these things helps us all get better at Magic. And if you want to make sure you catch future limited review videos and lots of other Magic content, don't forget to subscribe. Also, starting with Hour of Devastation, I have teamed up with 5colorcombo.com to improve drafting on their app. My card ratings are now used to help improve the AI's selection of cards during the draft. So the app has become much more realistic in terms of draft. So it's a great way to prepare for the format. Go check it out at 5colorcombo.com. You can find a link in the description below.